I imagine that we're already live. So after welcoming you and sending all of our love to those of you who are in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, and those of you who are in living through this terrible, terrible moment of wildfires, which is anything but what we need now, I just wanted to warmly welcome you to this session on May 1st. We are here today for a new session. This will be a session that I believe will open up a new outlook on the way that we have been approaching this issue. Let me tell you that I am here very interested and excited, and I hugely admire the work that will be presented by Betty Mendlovic. However, she won't be talking about this broad project that she has in the works and that we hope to see very soon because it's excellent. It's so full of insights and will be so enlightening. Today, we will hear from her about only one aspect of this work that she is doing, which brings together processes, events, and problems that intersect and are very complex. I'm talking about memory, Shoah, musealization, and anti-Semitism. And let me introduce our speaker for today. Betty is a graduate in sociology from the Ibero-American University and in communications from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She is a PhD candidate at UNAM for social sciences, and she's also an experienced researcher in the communications department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and she's also a very experienced editor with the Jerusalem Studies in Arabic and Islam journal at the Hebrew University. She is an instructor at the Hebrew University, a professor, and she continues to be actively engaged in the postgraduate activities in political and social sciences at UNAM. Her research is in sociological analysis and cultural memory, transnationalization of memory, and the memory of the Holocaust. She has made several publications. Some of the most recent ones include an analysis of these new era and in the annals of social memory, as well as the new conceptualization of memory. Betty, it's such a pleasure and a privilege to have you here with us today. You have joined some of the previous sessions. So without further ado, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you and to all of you who are joining us today. And we see some familiar faces, some other new faces. And Betty, please go ahead. Hello and good morning, good afternoon for those of you in other parts of the world. Judith, thank you. Thank you for those kind introductory remarks. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this webinar on Zoom. And thank you for being my advisor for my PhD thesis that I'm going to speak about in part right now. Thank you to ISGAP for the invitation and for our technical support team and also our interpreter. Thank you once again to all of you. And let me get started without any further ado. I will start by sharing my screen. I hope you can see my screen, my presentation. So now we seem to be ready. This presentation is entitled Anti-Semitism in Latin America in Comparative Perspectives. for the session. So my presentation is more specifically about musealization of memory in Latin America in a comparative perspective. Why and how do we bring together anti-Semitism and musealization? And here are a few points to bear in mind. As we already know, based on what we've heard from previous speakers in this cycle, anti-Semitism has acquired complex dynamics in globalized contexts. These expressions are influenced by specific historical, political, and social contexts that we are witnessing. On the other hand, the Shoah continues to be a major axis for Jewish identity. The musealization of Shoah takes shape in a territory-dependent space. It's linked to the local and national dimensions, the present and contextual dimensions, and at the same time, it is it occupies and mobilizes in and from deterritorialized and transnational social spaces. Museums interpret and build this memory from diverse structural and ideational frameworks, which are territorialized at the national level or detached from these elements. So attacks on memory are expressions of anti-Semitism. These are acts of violence, which can be symbolic or real. They intimidate or seek to intimidate and exclude the memory of the Shoah from public space. The expression of anti-Semitism seek to legitimize it. In the context of renewed anti-Semitism that we're witnessing, the role of museums takes on new importance. And this is what we're going to look at. Before I start, let me just, by way of conceptual introduction, talk about the idea, the concept of musealization. Based on my research, it's the construction of the memory of the Shoah in museum spaces. That's just one social memory modality, and it speaks to construction at a time in the present of a past event. So the event is the same. It happened in the past. It's the Shoah or the Holocaust. And this construction, this museum construction, is multiple in nature. It's ever-changing, active, and selective. So this is an institutionalized, stable production with very significant resource requirements. It's very also time-consuming. When we look at musealization, there's a double perspective. First of all, there is a process, social practices that build memory, that is, and on the other hand, it's a product. So material memory, objectified memory, symbolized in these exhibits, museum exhibits. So my operational approach, my universe of study, 192 instances of musealization of this memory. And it must also be said that these are not all Holocaust museums per se. I am referring to all museum spaces and any museum spaces where at least one room is devoted to the memory of the Holocaust. It goes from 1944 to 2019. That's the time frame, which is 2019, which is when I stopped collecting data. But at that time, non-crystallized projects were also taken into account that were about to come to fruition. And spatiality is dual. It's global, bearing in mind all of these musealization experiences, and also the possibility to differentiate based on changing features, which may be of regional nature or nationwide, national, or even local. We could look at all community museums, or all museums in Latin America, which is the case in point. There are two dimensions at play as well. One is the interpretive active dimension, as I call it. And the idea behind this is to look at the agency of social players that build this musealized memory. And then there's the contextual dimension divided into time and space. When it comes to time, we have musealization moments that I will mention later on. And in terms of space, we talk about heuristic and broad social space, which is also subdivided into signification and sense. So, world and Jewish world. And there are three systematization axes: convergences and divergences in memory, narrative codes, and tensions, memory tensions. Let me skip this, if you'll bear with me for a second, please. Going back to this one here. So, when we talk about anti Semitism in museum spaces, what we're looking at is symbolic and discourse related expressions, representations, right? And we also see omissions, distortions of the role of Jewish communities in his national historical narratives, whether there's an exclusion of indicators pertaining to the Jewishness of victims, minimization of their suffering during the event, or even erasure of the role of civil or national society in the Shoah. And we'll also look at specific acts of discrimination or institutional exclusion, and even talk about acts of physical violence. Throughout the analysis that I undertook, there are three moments that emerge in terms of musealization. And how did I come to that? It wasn't just an arbitrary division of time, but rather what I undertook was an analysis of the empirical landscape and the literature on musealization. Let me leave it at that, but let me just say that there are three moments, one, two, and three. They are listed here, but I will go into them into greater detail in due course. The first moment is what I call the moment of cultural oblivion, spanning from 1944, which is when the first museum was created, to 1961. Throughout this first moment, we see some convergences and divergences. But generally speaking, what is there in common is a lack of or scarcity of museums. So museum silence, cultural oblivion, in my opinion. So that doesn't mean that memory does not exist, that the event has been forgotten. It's an event that is very much alive in the historical memory and in the life of survivors and Jews in general. However, there is very little musealization. Out of the 192 cases that I mentioned, there are only 7 in this that are in museums. These 7 cases are characterized by a few trends. First of all, there's this issue of oblivion. However, there are some specificities at the national and regional levels. These museums are only based in Europe and in the state of Israel. And in the state of Israel, there are 3 museums at the time. I believe that you're all familiar with them. In Europe, there were 2 in Poland, the concentration camps of Auschwitz and Majdanek, and 1 museum in Lithuania, which was the first one of its kind there, and one in the Netherlands, the Anne Frank House. And that will be the harbinger of the changes that we'll see in a minute. Without going into greater detail, we have the memory, a memory that is held by survivors. It's experiential memory. And then at the same time, It's a memory that is territorialized and very much entrenched in geopolitical context. And this leads to the creation of a very heterogeneous landscape in terms of memory. One thing is the memory musealized in Israel as the one in the Netherlands or in Poland. So aside from that, there's a musealization which is not really national, but nationalized. For a museum to be able to crystallize as such, it needs support and approval of the state. That is a major constraint and does have a major impact on the musealization landscape that we see. Most of these museums are state-owned. So, on the one hand, we have musealization by the Jewish world, by survivors. And then on the other hand, there is a need for state approval and authorization for this memory to be crystallized. So, this in some way explains why there's such little visibilization of this memory. And let's be reminded that, as we said, amongst the expressions of anti Semitism, we see the lack of visibilization of this memory. Here, I'd like to bring a very good example. And that is that of Poland. There are two former concentration camps, Auschwitz and Majdanek, which were musealized, actively musealized by the state. But this musealization is more geared towards the Poland's national memory and presenting the victimization of the Polish nation. The memory of the Holocaust doesn't have much of a place there and has to fight for visibilization. And then on the other hand, we have Israel with three museums, one housed in a kibbutz, two others are state-owned, one from the religious standpoint, which is Martefa Shoah, and then there's the state-owned museum, the one that we're all familiar with, Yad Vashem. So this landscape where we see that 50% or almost 50% of museums at this time housed in Israel is the consequence of the interest of the Jewish state in musealizing this memory as a national memory, so to speak. And let us also bear in mind, as an illustrative case, that a decision is made to um, afford Israeli nationality to all Holocaust victims post-mortem. So the motivation, and there's a strong motivation for the memory of the Holocaust to be built as a very important part of the newly created state of Israel. And at Auschwitz, as I said already, the memory of the Holocaust faces many impediments in becoming visible. Let me give you an example. It was necessary for the organized Jewish bodies, in part in Poland, such as the Central Jewish Community in Poland, to be involved, and also for national bodies, which is the Organization for the Memory of the Holocaust, to become involved so as to give visibility to this memory. One of the reasons given was that Jews did not have a specific nationality, and that Jewish memory was diluted in victims' nationalities. So the first thing that was introduced was the countries pavilion, where there were victims divided by countries. And along these lines, the Jewishness or the Jewish memory is becomes invisible. There is an also signification of the memory of this event. And this is part of this lack of visibility because we see isolated descriptions and there's a Jewish description and then this other description where the idea is to integrate the memory of the Holocaust. And these are the national narratives. These two separate worlds that do not come together include separate descriptions. And what we are faced with is with two fragmented memory, worlds of memory. And then there are emerging transnational circuits. I've touched on that already. And the type of musealization that will put an end to this trend and start the second moment is the Anne Frank Museum in the Netherlands. That's where the musealization of memory went into a civic setting where there is more room for visibilization. And this is what I call the first mnemonic boom. And so there's a geopolitical extension and two communities of world memory, which are broader, but that are still limited to the Jewish world. There's also the institutionalization of the memory by the organized Jewish world or reorganized Jewish world. At first, the memory of the Holocaust wasn't made visible by the institutional Jewish world. And there are a few examples here where Jewish community leadership in the United States was not conducive to musealization. There was a proposal for the creation of a Holocaust museum in the United States, but the organized Jewish world in the United States said that it wouldn't be advisable to shed so much light on Jewish victimization and especially Jewish particularism. So, on the one hand, we have this memory that erupts into community spaces, especially in the United States. There are 8 Holocaust museums right now at that time in the United States. There are 32 instances of musealization at this time. There were only 7 in the first period, as you might recall. And memory, not divorced from what is happening in general, and I'm talking about the Nuremberg trials, the legitimization of the memory of survivors. So the memory of the Holocaust becomes more presentable, quote unquote, and this is a trend that emerges especially in the United States. But together with this, there's another emerging trend, which is also very interesting and happens in Western Europe, especially in Germany. There is motivation and action for musealization coming from the non-Jewish world for the first time in Germany, where musealization of the Holocaust seeks to break away from the Germany of the past and the musealization of the past, and wants to create this new civic world in Germany that renounces what happened during the Holocaust. So there is a specific case, very interesting, by the way, of a museum where one of the markers in a small town called Wiesbaden in Germany, there was a specific area that was going to be demolished. There were several things. Like there was a small mikveh, and there were some ancestral markers of Jewish life, aside from a synagogue that was bombed during the Holocaust and that was used as a warehouse later. What they did was clearly seek to erase Jewish memory. And this person, Guter Benebek, decided that they could not allow the erasure of memory. So that it was an act of civic action not to allow this. So even though the state was not interested, he was able to promote the building of a museum about the role of Germany and German citizenry in the Holocaust. So at this time that we're looking at, what we see is a more community-based space, but there is a civic musealization space that is emerging and coming to light. There is a trend that to have the Holocaust memory to consolidate as a resource for self-representation for Jewish communities and as part of the community capital. And then there is a detachment from other factors that depend on the territorial and national dimensions. And this has led to a momentum where it is a moment where it's easier for the memory of the Holocaust to expand. And this leads us into the third moment of musealization from 1993 until 2019, which I have named expanded boom and globalization, or second mnemonic boom, which with quantitative expressions and geopolitical extension. So we see musealization not only in Europe, the United States, and the Anglo-Saxon world. During the second mnemonic moment, we had two museums in Mexico, one in Mexico and one in Uruguay, so two in Latin America. So musealization during this period of time extended to the whole world. I'm talking about the Far East, Africa, Asia even, China and Japan. As part of this boom, which might point towards a certain amount of globalization, there are some specificities that must be brought up according to geopolitical contexts and those that have to do with the world in general and with the Jewish world in particular, based on cultural resources, a means of community organization, and even socio-demographic movements. What we can see during this third moment is what I call a mini boom in Latin America and in the former Soviet bloc countries. And those countries that were satellites of the USSR. At that point, the Shoah becomes universal and globalizes as a universal moral paradigm based on codes of tolerance and human rights. There are new stakeholders, new spaces, new narratives, new articulations, and there is a code of a meeting between the Jewish and the non-Jewish worlds through the musealization of the Holocaust. And there are some very interesting emerging trends, such as the musealization by stakeholders who belong to the explicit Christian world. What we also see is awareness raising through several national musealization cases where in the past the memory of the Holocaust was minimized, dismissed, and erased. And at that point, it opens up to the public museum world. And I'm talking about France specifically, where it went from having no museums during the first stage, then two during the second, and 16 during the third. Italy went from 0 to 8 at this third period of musealization. What we can see here is, if we were to look at it on a map, we would see a large extension of territory where these museums are to be found. And I don't know if you've heard about, there is a joke about Holocaust museums. The question is, what is a global city? What is an important city? And the answer is a city that hosts or is home to a Holocaust museum. And there is a major link between capital cities and also cities with a high level of globalization and this phenomenon. So, aside from this, with this in mind and having a very globally extended map of musealization, what we see is new fault lines in memory, where it can be said that musealization is no longer divided into regions, such as the former Western and Eastern blocs in Europe or Latin America and the Americas outside of Latin America, but rather there is a broader division. And here I will resort to the terminology of cultural worlds. So quite clearly, what we see is a musealization that is extended to a world that is, broadly speaking, one that is Western Judeo-Christian. So we're talking about democratic countries, non-authoritarian countries, and global cities, capital cities. Let me refer to an exception that I came across, an exception to this trend, where instead of a museum, what they have is an exhibit at about the Holocaust in an Arab country, and that's very interesting. That happened since 2019. So let us now move to the narrative codes throughout these moments. They are of the essence because they subsume the environment, the political environment, the cultural environment for each of these moments. I will speed up here. Moment one. So there is a code of historical, existential, and moral progression, which is very specifically Jewish. So the code of Shoah and Tkuma, which means redemption, so Shoah and redemption, in the establishment of the state of Israel, but it's also the future redemption in the Jewish religion. There's another code that begins with the Lithuania Museum and extends to several instances in Eastern Europe, in East Europe, and the first museum in Mexico, which is the code of loss of cultural, of human culture, which is more culturalistic, so to speak, in terms of characterizing Judaism. There's also the civic humanistic narrative, which comes ashore with the Anne Frank Museum. It's a code that allows for universalization without erasing the Jewish particularity, where the condition of victim is presented as a universal warning. And then there is the code of the Shoah as a national victimization, that's quite clear. What it does is erase memory, and it is permeated by anti-Semitism. Now, moment number two. The historical progression narrative goes from being national and Jewish, Shoah Tkuma, to becoming a civic formula. especially seen in the tolerance and human rights museums in the United States. There's another formula, which is the Holocaust as a paradigmatic genocide. That's what I call the Bauer formula, where the particularity and universality antinomy is resolved without losing the Jewish specificity, but with the possibility universalizing um, uh, of universalization through other instances of genocidal acts. Another very interesting quote that emerges during this period of time is the rescue narrative. And here I will use the term that Judith was actually coined, being national, transnational. And as part of this code, musealization is a resource to be able to resolve this antinomy of being national and transnational. And we see this in Latin America and in East Europe, especially in the museums. In the United States, what we usually see is the civic formula that I mentioned at first. So the community that musealizes is it brings this memory into a narrative through a space of shelter, of recognition amongst nations, and musealization from the point of view of admission of national, political, and moral historical responsibility, with marked differences between countries. And this began in Germany, as I said, and the Christian Solidarity Code. Then, moment number 3, new codes emerge. One of them is emphasis on survival and resilience. And I've seen this very often in the United States, some museums in the United States, where the trend is they tried to exterminate us, but we survived, some of them, some of us, of course, there were losses, but Judaism is still alive physically and spiritually, individually and collectively, both. Tolerance and human rights as a codes of meaning, and also a code of globalized historical responsibility, where musealizing the Holocaust becomes an international standard and even a symbolic requirement to belong to the bloc of democratic nations, as in the case of the EU, where we see a correlation between countries that belong or want to belong to the EU or join the EU, and then at the same time, they musealized the Holocaust. Now, here are a few examples. I don't know how much time we have left, Judith, for a few more specific examples, if I may. I wonder whether you'd like a few more minutes. We can give you a few more minutes, maybe 5. Certainly. Maybe some of these examples have already been mentioned by me already, but here we're looking at some museums such as the Auschwitz Museum, and the context is the communist Poland, the anti-fascist narrative, also minimizing or erasing the memory of the Shoah, and tensions or difficulties are this resistance, this pushback in the face of recognition. The Jewish Museum of Vilnius in Lithuania under the USSR, which was created in 1944. It was established by Holocaust survivors. But it was accepted by the state because it fits in with this anti-fascist narrative. However, by 1948, things had changed, and the museum was closed down due to clear state-sponsored anti-Semitism, and memory in Lithuania would be suppressed for decades. And it was only much later that there was a museum that was opened up to the public. And then there's the Anne Frank house, which was a watershed, and where the context allowed for musealization. even though the state wasn't interested, the citizens were. So there isn't much political tension there. And there's the commemoration, which is facilitated by very significant Jewish and non-Jewish world participation, especially non-Jewish. And I'm talking about the involvement of very major political and cultural personalities in Holland, as well as the impact of the diary of Anne Frank around the world. So, moment two, Dachau in 1965, of course, the concentration camp, the former concentration camp, existed and was based in Dachau, a village, and the community leaders. I don't know if it was a town or a city, but the religious leaders even denied it and or tried to cover it up and hide it. But several attempts were made for the premises to be used for other purposes. But there was a great deal of pressure exerted by a very small part of the population in Dachau, and more importantly, by movements, transnational Jewish survivor movements, for Dachau not to fall into oblivion, for this former concentration camp to be established as a museum. So we've talked about the Wiesbaden Museum. Excuse me, Betty, I'm going to interrupt you. I'm going to make a suggestion based on on the wealth of your material. How about we go into the third moment and maybe a final reflection by you to to connect all of this historical, political, and identity, national and transnational dynamics, and see how they are interconnected today uh, anew by the onslaught of anti-Semitism. So an example from moment number three, and if we're lucky, we'll have some time for questions. So we'd like to hear some closing thoughts from you, and I apologize for interrupting, Betty. Of course, I will go into our third moment. Of course, there are so many more museums. We're talking about 154 of them during this third moment. It's basically explosive growth. So many more museums are there, and there are so many more examples. And as Judith was saying, these examples include some that are closer to political anti-Semitism or even an anti-Semitism that is more contemporary in nature. There were several anti-Semitic armed attacks on on museums. There was a shootout in 2009 in Washington. A guard died. The same thing happened in Belgium with the death of 4 people, including an Israeli citizen and 3 Belgian citizens in 2014. There was an arson at the Cardiff Museum in Indiana in 2003, and there were other instances of arsons. Sachsenhausen in 1992, there was an arson. There was an exhibit on Jewish persecution that had just been inaugurated. And after this arson, the perpetrator was taken into custody, and these exhibit was rebuilt, but the remains of the arson attack were left there just so they wouldn't be forgotten. And then, very interestingly, the War Museum in Canada, in Ottawa, is a very old museum. Between 97 and 98, it was decided that this museum was going to be revamped and updated. And the proposals that were put forth included adding a gallery on the Holocaust. And this created a major public debate with several arguments, most for, but many and mostly against. because what was argued was that the Holocaust cannot be included as part of the national military memory, that it's a tragedy, it's a tragic memory, but it does not belong to Canada. So eventually, this museum was discarded, it never crystallized, but the Canadian Museum for Human Rights did include this issue, and it includes 10 exhibits. One of them is very large about the Holocaust, and others are about World War II, about First Nations, about several other problems involving human rights. And this museum has been very much criticized for devoting too much space to the memory of the Holocaust. It's as if the value of a specific memory were being weighed vis-a-vis another one. Why is this one getting 200 cubic meters, whereas this other type of memory is getting only 10 cubic meters? So the Zeckelman Holocaust Center, it works with this very heartrending architectural aesthetics, and there were so many instances of criticism and vandalism, including graffiti, etc. And then this other museum that was just built, but was never opened. It was because there was a major dispute about the whitewashing of the Hungarian complicity, and there is a boycott by Yad Vashem and the Jewish community. So that's in Hungary, the House of Fates that I was talking about. And then there are 17 museums in Latin America, two of them only during the second moment, and the balance during the third moment. And they're broader and they're different from each other, and they have different narratives. One of them is the one in Guatemala, which was developed by Father Dubois from the Yachad Inamun movement. There are others, some very interesting examples, such as the Charobamba Museum. It's the Jewish Museum of Bolivia in Charobamba. And this museum was erected in an area that received quite a few Jewish refugees. And it's the result of a cooperation project between the German embassy and the Jewish community of Bolivia. I'm going to interrupt you again, Betty. I wonder whether I wouldn't want to interrupt you again, but I find that it's very important what you just said at the beginning of your presentation today. So you might want to stop sharing the screen so that we can see your face more prominently. I think that what you said about the musealization in the construction of memory and how important this memory of the Shoah is in the development of Jewish identity, and how anti-Semitism today can bring this memory into question based on the arguments that you brought, which are very interesting about each and every one of the cases where there were attacks or acts of vandalism. But as you know, the theories, sociological, humanistic theories that speak of abuse of memory, right? So museums are usually challenged. So so I'd like to hear how you feel about that, if you will, and then we'd like to open the floor for questions. It's very important to talk about how museums create and reflect memory. Betty, certainly we did not see the last few images, but in Latin America, we have museums in institutional spaces where there aren't that many opportunities for protests or vandalism and physical attacks. But now, if you go online, that's where you see some quite clear examples of very contemporary anti-Semitism in its expressions, being anti-Zionist and also leveling accusations of genocide. So if you agree, how about we open the floor for questions and comments by our colleagues here with us online? Many have turned on their cameras, others have not, so we can't see them, but the floor is open if you have any questions for Betty about her presentation. Daniel, please go ahead. Hi, and thank you. Betty, your presentation was very interesting. I was a bit familiar with this and with your project from when you started off your work. So your conceptual and analytical framework was very good and very conducive to understanding. I would have liked for you to focus more on Latin America based on the title of your presentation, due to issues that have not been resolved in some museums with more universalistic aspirations. The question is, what is the connection between Jewish memory and First Nations memory in terms of the conquest and genocides? And how does this connect to the tragic events of dictatorships in Latin America and the connections between the memory of the Shoah and other memories? One of them is, as a very important example, is the document Never Again, which was seen as there was a connection there, and how this reverberates the re-victimization of the Palestinians in Gaza and the issue, for example, in Argentina. These are all questions that are there latent, and I assume that you may have worked on them, and for lack of time, we're not able to go into that. But I would have liked to hear about the museums and how they differ from each other in Latin America. Well, that's a very interesting approach that we cannot, of course, overlook. And if I may generalize for a minute, we're going back to this connection, this very strong connection between the historical event, the Shoah, that is, and how it is connected to political, economic, cultural, and social events in different places. So that trend is there. And they are very disparate. They're very interesting. So, by way of example, there's the Museum of the Anne Frank House in Argentina, where there is a specific connection drawn between the memory of the Holocaust and the memory of the of state-sponsored terrorism in Argentina. That used to be, the house used to be Hilda's house. It's called Hilda's house, and that's where some of those who were persecuted by state-sponsored terrorism took refuge. In Argentina, there are other types of connections, and I'm not talking about anti-Semitism here, but I think these are also very interesting and should be brought up so that we can talk about this connection between the present context and the past, historical past. And here I'm referring about the Entre Rios Jewish Museum. I wonder whether you're familiar with this museum, but it's very interesting. The creators of the museum believed that it decided to have four galleries in the museum, very important galleries, and one of them is about the Shoah. The other one is Jewish immigration. The other one is the State of Israel. And finally, the contributions made by Jews to Argentina. So it's very interesting to see how each of these versions, these elements, bring things together differently. And also, we must understand about that there's the time of the historical event, there's the time for the crystallization of the memory in museum, and then a time for reformulation, because museums change. I did not undertake a specific analysis about the trends in Latin America, because this is part of my thesis, which is more general. And I'm just trying to frame some of the perspectives that I see, that I can envision. But this is such a broad topic, and it allows for so many points of view, that I think this would be one worthy of taking up. Thank you, Daniel, for your question, and thank you, Betty, for your answer. If I may, I'd like to add to what was just said, that to this joint reflection created by your work about memory, and how it's built and how it connects to other histories and memories. Something that we're witnessing today, and that is now reverting in a critical manner to anti-Semitic language, which takes shape through anti-Zionistic accusations having to do with the Shoah and human rights and Zionism and the State of Israel. Because historically, if I may say, the Shoah is the territory that dramatically convenes the engagement of so many brilliant minds who are at the same time Zionists and work on the criminalization of genocide, the issue of human rights, just to name a few elements. And this joint birth now reverts this. And so, without a doubt, Zionism, the State of Israel, have had their own development, which do not necessarily have not necessarily moved ahead with the original projects. But it is also true that the international human rights community has systematically excluded everything Jewish and Zionism. So in that way, museums are also a battleground for this, right? I believe that this is yet another aspect that your research is thought-provoking about. So there is a narrative that in Latin America, for sure, has been very dramatically having an effect, especially as a consequence of the Gaza war, and has and the whole issue of identification with the Palestinian cause and solidarity with the Palestinian cause has led to a whole issue, a whole environment about the Holocaust. And if I may, I will be brief so that you can close yourself. What we're left with is the fact that this accusation leveled at the memory of the Holocaust, as if it were part of a Western memory that oppresses the global South and Latin America and First Nations, indigenous nations, and that hurts them, is something that we're seeing constantly today. Betty, I see that we have also ISGAP here with us. They are our timekeepers, and they are here to remind us that it is time for us to wrap up. So let me thank you for your presentation. I think that we are about to conclude the paper that you're about to conclude the paper that we're all expecting, that has taken a long time. You yourself know how long time how important time is when it comes to the work that you do, not just space, but also time. So thank you so much for this presentation. I wonder whether anybody else would like to say something before we part. Florinda, go ahead, please. I have a question, which is not related to what you just said. which came to mind when I was looking at those tables. Is there information about to what extent Holocaust survivors have cooperated with the creation, towards the creation of these museums? Because we are all aware of the fact that for a period of time, which would be more or less that of your first moment, survivors did not want to talk. They want nothing to have nothing to do with the issue. And then they started opening up later on. So that's my question, just in general terms. I wonder whether there is information about that. Yes, without a doubt, yes. And I could even say that it is true that memory wasn't as visible back then and people were reluctant to speak. But there are also very many cases of museums, especially in the United States, cases of museums or attempts motivation to musealize, interest in musealization, who were not able to they were not able to crystallize for lack of resources or for lack of support. Many survivors have had the idea to create a museum but didn't make it. Then there was a whole generation of survivors who remained silent for a long time. And then when they started seeing Holocaust denial, for example, at the museum where they had this neo-Nazi march in the Museum of Chicago, at the Museum of Chicago in Illinois, faced with this threat of a neo-Nazi march, survivors felt this wish to speak. And then there was another generation of the children of survivors who were very active in musealization. Then finally, I'll be brief, but these are the children of survivors who are interested in helping build or building museums in East Europe or in the former Soviet Union countries. And that's where they come from, their ancestors come from. And a very interesting case is that of Donald Trump's son-in-law. I can't remember his last name, but he's married to Trump's daughter. His last name is Kushner, Jared Kushner, actually. And he was instrumental to the creation of a museum in Novogrudok. That was very interesting. Thank you. Well, the wealth of the topics that you have brought up here and your vision of the place, this combination of memory, identity, museums, the event itself, and currently how they're being challenged, Holocaust denial and accusations being leveled of there being a new Holocaust. But this time there is an inversion, a reversion of the category of the victim and victimizer. So this ends this session. We'd like to thank you, thank all of you, thank our speaker, thank all of you who so heroically on Labor Day joined us this morning. And, it's in Latin America, it wasn't May 1st, it was October 17th. It was a sunny Sunday, right? That they spoke of in Argentina. Now we're talking about a sunny May 1st. So I send a big hug to Florinda and to all of us, Debbie Reutemann. I don't know who else is here with us, but please, Lydia Lerner is here with us. I don't see you, Lydia. You're not opening your cameras, but I send you a warm hug, and I hope that we can all go back to normalcy and to which is what we wish for so much. A big hug to everyone, and see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Judith.